The Seven Wonders of the Ancient World is a list of awe-inspiring buildings and monuments from classical antiquity, compiled by various ancient Hellenic tourists, and comprises sites from around southeastern Europe, Western Asia and North Africa, which is unsurprising given that the lists were put together by ancient Greeks, who wouldn't have been able to travel across the globe as easy as we can today, so obvious geographical limits were placed upon them. But regardless, the Seven Wonders themselves are a testament to the ingenuity and genius of which humanity is capable, and the beauty that resides within our species. And I know that kind of positivity is not common on the internet, but there we are, it's been said. The first reference we get to such a list was from the 2nd century BCE Greek mathematician Philo of Byzantium, Byzantium being the modern day city of Istanbul in Turkey. But unfortunately, Philo's manuscript is sadly incomplete, and so we only know of 6 of the wonders from his account entitled The 7 Sights of the World. And so it is to the person most associated with the 7 Wonders canon that we turn to as our main source, that being the Greek epigrammist of the 1st century BCE, Antipater of Sidon. Sidon being the modern day city of Seda in Lebanon, and Antipater wrote in a poem in his Greek anthology volume 9 telling us all about his 7 wonders.
I have gazed on the walls of impregnable Babylon along which chariots may race, and on the Zeus by the banks of the Alpheus. I have seen the hanging gardens and the colossus of the Helios, the great man-made mountains of the lofty pyramids, and the gigantic tomb of Mausolus. But when I saw the sacred house of Artemis that towers to the clouds, the others were placed in the shade, for the sun himself has never looked upon its equal outside Olympus.
Now there are a few problems there. Firstly, Antipater almost certainly never set eyes on the walls of Babylon. And secondly, you may know that the walls of Babylon aren't an item on the list of 7 that we know today, and that's because, like so many things in history, what you think you know is probably at least a little bit wrong. Because the list of 7 that I'll be taking you through today is the proper list of 7. It's the septet of classical architecture and art that everyone agrees are the 7 wonders of the ancient world. But this list was only fully agreed upon much closer to the present day than most people would think. The original compilers of the histories, people like Philo, Antipater and Diodorus, were writers in the late centuries BCE, and some wrote in the early centuries CE. But the final list that we accept today was only really agreed upon during the Renaissance, a period which saw a renewed interest in the classical styles of art from antiquity, and an interest in the best of the best of the best, and thus the 7 wonders mythos was rediscovered and agreed upon finally. A little lesson there that the history of history itself is an amazing treasure trove of human jiggery-pokery. Anyways, as much as I love to preambulate, it's time to get on with the list itself. Let's do this. The Great Pyramid at Giza was built in 2584 BCE and was commissioned by Pharaoh Khufu, or Cheops as he would have been known to the Egyptians themselves, and at its completion stood a staggering 146 metres or 481 feet in height, making it the tallest building in the world for almost 4,000 years, until the cheeky chaps at Lincoln Cathedral in England built their spire in 1311, which just pipped it out. But holding the record for just shy of 4 millennia is not a bad knock at all. The Great Pyramid is simultaneously the first of the 7 wonders to be built and the only one still left standing. Look, when the ancient Egyptians built stuff, they built it big and they built it to last. The pyramid predated its nearest competitor on the list by 2,000 years and has survived the most recently destroyed by 600 years. The only problem is though, when I say it survived, that's only partly true. What we can see here, what we all think of as the Great Pyramid, is actually the internal core structure of the thing. Originally it was covered in highly polished, smooth white limestone, as shown here in an artist's impression, and what a sight it must have been. But alas, an earthquake in 1303 CE loosened the outer casing stones, and most were subsequently taken away to be used in beefing up local fortresses, and some were used in the building of the Alabaster Mosque in Cairo. Here is an example of one of the casing stones which is at the British Museum, and they should really be giving that back. And that's a sentiment I think I'll be uttering on this channel pretty frequently. But anyways, the pyramid is thought to have been built as a burial site for Khufu, although his body has yet to be found and is perhaps not even there, because he was either buried elsewhere or a rather grim looter from the past stole it at some point over the last 4,000 years. The interior of the structure contains 3 chambers, the so-called King's Chamber, Queen's Chamber and the subterranean unfinished chamber. The 2 above ground chambers being connected by the Grand Gallery, and just take a look at this breathtaking construction. astonishing. To think that these people were working with such rudimentary technology and tools, and yet were able to build something so awe-inspiring and durable. Absolutely spectacular. There are also loads of other buildings and stuff in the Great Pyramid complex, most notably the other two large, but not as large pyramids, those of Khafre and Menkaure, as well of course as the Great Sphinx, which I personally think should have been on the list of wonders as well, but its omission is forgivable due to the fact that it was regularly covered or partially covered by sandbanks from the encroaching desert, meaning the ancient Greeks may have been largely unaware of its true size and grandeur. But returning to the Great Pyramid itself, contrary to a popular myth spread by ancient Greek historians, slaves did not in fact build the pyramids. Rather, there was an army of tens of thousands of highly skilled craftsmen and architects who did that work. Now, whilst there was very likely slave labour used in support roles in the burgeoning town of Giza, the actual construction was done by some of the greatest builders to have ever existed. I mean, it's still mostly there 4,500 years after it was built, for crying out loud. I mean, the modern iteration of the British Parliament building has only been there 150 years, and it's crumbling to the point where they are going to have to decant to another building soon, whilst the Palace of Westminster is repaired very significantly. And yet, with the most primitive of technology and tools available to them, the ancient Egyptians built a wondrous beast of a structure, and it's still there now. Amazing stuff. And anyone who tries to pull some ancient aliens did it nonsense gets blocked. Instant permablock, son. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon were theoretically an ascending series of tiered gardens containing an impressive array of plant life in the ancient city of Babylon, in what is now the Babil region of the modern-day nation of Iraq. They were built on the orders of King Nebuchadnezzar II and are said to have been destroyed after the year 1 CE, when the last of the descriptions of the place mentioning it as still existing was written by Roman historian Quintus Curtius Rufus. Now, as you may have noticed from my use of the word theoretically in that opening description, I do not believe that the Hanging Gardens ever actually existed at Babylon, and that's for three main reasons. 1. There are no extant Babylonian sources which mention the gardens, including from Nebuchadnezzar's own extensive and thorough inscriptions, in which he details pretty much everything, but fails to mention anything about a supposedly amazing garden thing he had going on at the time. Yeah, seems pretty unlikely to me as well. 2. To this very day, there have been zero, I repeat, zero archaeological finds or evidence uncovered at Babylon that suggests the existence of any such gardens. And 3. The historical sources which attest to the existence of the gardens are mainly from writers who had not been to Babylon and thus couldn't have actually seen the gardens personally. Or they come from quotes of quotes like this from Romano-Jewish historian Josephus, who, quoting Berosus of Marduk, described the gardens like this.
In this palace he erected very high walls supported by stone pillars, and by planting what was called a pensile paradise and replenishing it with all sorts of trees, he rendered the prospect an exact resemblance of a mountainous country.
But bear in mind, that is Josephus in the 1st century CE, quoting a source from over 300 years prior, from documents that had been copied and recopied God knows how many times. That isn't really strong evidence of anything, to be honest. This second and third hand source stuff doesn't wash with me, not if it isn't backed up by credible primary sources or archaeological findings. And in addition to all of that, there are historians of the time such as Herodotus who did in fact travel to Babylon but never mentioned the gardens, which could be coincidence, but allied to all the other points I've mentioned here, suggests that the gardens are merely a poetic creation, which is meant to depict how highly the Greeks thought of the Babylonian civilization, that this was the kind of thing that they would create, not that they actually did create it. However, there is also another competing theory which suggests that the Hanging Gardens were actually at the city of Nineveh in Upper Mesopotamia, again in modern day Iraq. But I ain't doing a video on the Hanging Gardens of Nineveh, it's the Hanging Gardens of Babylon we're interested here, and as far as I'm concerned, they were a figment of ancient Greek imaginations, and thus conjecture about the types of plants that were there and the construction methods and all of that is rather moot, so I suggest we move on.
There you stand 100 feet above the silent decks, striding along the deep as if the masts were gigantic stilts, while beneath you and between your legs, as it were, swim the hugest monsters of the sea, even as ships once sailed between the boots of the famous Colossus at Old Rhodes.
Well, I'll stop you there, Herman. You did well with the rest of your novel, a classic of American literature if you don't mind me saying, but you've let yourself down there with that Colossus bit. Poor historical form. Although, to be fair, Melville was probably going by popular knowledge of the giant based on dodgy medieval writings. But anyways, the point is, the Colossus did not straddle the port entrance. I'll get onto it in a second, but first, the explainy bit. The Colossus of Rhodes was a bronze statue of the ancient Greek sun god Helios, built in 280 BCE at the city of Rhodes, on the Dodecanese islands of the modern-day nation of Greece. When finished, the statue stood 33 metres or 108 feet tall, which is roughly the same height as the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbour today. The statue was erected to celebrate the victory in 304 BCE of the Rhodians and their Ptolemaic Egyptian allies over the forces of Demetrius Polyocrates of Macedon, who had been besieging the city. The contemporary sources differ as to whether the statue was made of the melted down siege weaponry that the Macedonians had been forced to abandon on the island during their hurried retreat, or whether they simply sold that equipment and used the money gained from it to fund the building project. But either way, the Macedonians paid for the construction of the symbol of their own defeat, which must have been pretty galling. Anyways, according to the ancient Greek anthologies, the dedication text for the Colossus read,
"To you, O sun, the people of Dorian Rhodes set up this bronze statue reaching to Olympus, when they had pacified the waves of war and crowned their city with the spoils taken from the enemy. Not only over the seas, but also on land did they kindle the lovely torch of freedom and independence. For to the descendants of Heracles belongs dominion over sea and land."
which is exactly the kind of thing you should etch onto the plinth of a giant victory statue you just built. Good for you, ancient Rhodians. Good for you. Anyways, as I may have mentioned a moment ago, the statue did not actually straddle the entry of the city's port, as many medieval and even Victorian-era depictions suggest. Given the proportions of the statue, if it had stood astride the two seawalls of the port entry, it wouldn't have allowed many ships to pass underneath it. So as awesome as this image is, and it undeniably is, it wasn't practical and actually didn't happen. What did happen, however, is a little unclear, as the sources vary on the precise location, but it is thought that it would have been built on one side of the port entry, but probably not very close to it, considering that when it was destroyed it fell onto land rather than into the ocean or into the harbour waters, suggesting it was a little way inland from the harbour entry itself. And speaking of its destruction, the Colossus was the shortest lived of all the Seven Wonders. It stood for just 54 years when in 226 BCE a massive earthquake rocked the island and the statue buckled at the knees and smashed to the ground. And although offers were made to reconstruct the giant, the Rhodians were afraid that they had offended Helios and did not wish to anger him any further, and so declined. The wreckage of the statue lay there for 800 years, with ancient historians like Strabo of Amasea and Pliny the Elder writing of the ruins as a tourist attraction which drew travellers from across the Mediterranean. In terms of what eventually happened to the debris from the Colossus, there is a common story which is told that in 653 a Muslim force under the leadership of Muawiyah, the first caliph of the Umayyad dynasty, captured Rhodes and melted down the statue's remnants and sold it to a Jewish trader from Emesa, which is the city of Homs in modern-day Syria. But it's uncertain as to whether this story is actually true or born of religious bigotry. An attempt to paint the Muslims as uncivilized for not appreciating the civilizational value of the relic, and to show the Jews of the region to be money-hungry barbarians, which is an age-old anti-Semitic trope. And the ancient sources can hardly be considered unbiased on the matter, as they are based on the now lost writings of an early Byzantine clergyman and noble called Theophanes the Confessor, who had a vested interest in attacking the religious minorities of the Eastern Mediterranean. But regardless, not even fragments of the statue remain today. But there have been recent plans to construct a replica of the Colossus, and I for one hope they do. The world can always use more massive bronze statues. The Temple of Artemis at Ephesus was a Greek temple built to honour the Hellenistic god Artemis, who was the goddess of the hunt, the wilderness, chastity, wild animals, and the moon. She had a lot going on, that one. The Artemision, as the temple is also known, was built at the ancient Greek city of Ephesus, which is now an abandoned site near the town of Seljuk in modern-day Turkey. Ancient Greek mythology recounts the first temple at the site having been built by the Amazons, a mythical race of warrior women believed to have originated in Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey, but I'm not buying mythical people making buildings and all that sort of stuff, so we'll move right along to the real history. The temple, at least in its first iteration, was the second oldest of the Seven Wonders, or at least the ones that actually existed, and yes, I'm looking at you, Hanging Gardens. The first temple was destroyed by flooding and was rebuilt in 550 BCE at the behest of King Croesus of Lydia. Lydia being an ancient empire in what is present-day Western Turkey, and that iteration of the building survived around 2 centuries before it was destroyed by arson. It was burnt down by a man called Herostratus. He set fire to the temple's wooden beams in an attempt to gain fame at any cost, leading to the coining of the now rather archaic but at one time very popular phrase Herostratic fame, and unsurprisingly Herostratus was put to death and the Ephesians were forbade from ever mentioning his name again, and it's only down to outside historical sources that we even know his name or the story of the Second Temple's destruction. This all then led to the construction of the Third Temple, which is the one we are really interested in, as it was the Third Temple at Ephesus that made it onto the list of 7 wonders. Now, we really aren't certain what the first 2 temples look like, but the third one we are pretty sure of, and just look at it, it's a beauty. Anyways, this version of the temple was first offered to be paid for by Alexander of Macedon. Yes, the Alexander the Great. But the Ephesians for some reason turned him down and later rebuilt it after Alexander's untimely death. The third temple was much bigger than the first 2, standing 18 metres or 60 feet in height, 69 metres or 225 feet wide, and 137 metres or 450 feet in length. An absolute monster of a building by standards of the time. Anyways, the third ancient temple would survive over 600 years, during which time Ephesus was taken over by the Roman Empire, and during that period the temple would sometimes be referred to as the Temple of Diana, with Diana being the goddess from the ancient Roman pantheon most closely associated with Artemis. And indeed the Romans respected the importance of the Artemisian and its regular festivals, which was a pretty common tactic of the early to middle Roman Empire, that of assimilation and coexistence with local culture, rather than the later persecution of local pagan worship. The temple was ultimately destroyed in 268 CE by the Goths. No, not those ones. Yeah, those ones. The Thracian Gothic tribes, to be precise. Thrace occupying the land which is basically modern-day Bulgaria, although borders are inexact in the ancient world, and indeed hardline borders are a rather modern affectation, born of the creation of the nation-state in the 18th and 19th centuries. But despite the temple's destruction in the 3rd century CE, the temple was at least partially rebuilt and limped on into the 5th century, before becoming totally disused. The remnants of the building were mostly taken to Constantinople, another name for the modern-day city of Istanbul, where some of the columns were even used in the building of the Hagia Sophia, which at that time was a Christian church, and many of the Artemisian statues and relics were placed in palaces around Constantinople. And from there the site was abandoned and ultimately lost over the following 1300 years, until in 1869 the site was rediscovered by British archaeologist John Wood, whose middle name was, I kid you not, Turtle. This man's name was John Turtle Wood. He had an amazing name and also an epic beard. He had a lot going for him, that one. Archaeological study at the site in the following 150 years have found a massive bounty of finds, including fragments of the first 2 temples used for backfill as the foundation for the 3rd temple, the oldest pot hoard of coins in the world, and various pieces of the 3rd temple itself, which were left by the original looters of the place. The site at Ephesus is abandoned today except for these 2 columns of dissociated ancient masonry. And there's something quite hauntingly beautiful about the desolation of the site. Once the place where one of the most important and beautiful buildings in the world stood, but now eerie nothingness, the broken remnants of a past glory. The mausoleum of Halicarnassus was a tomb built on the orders of Queen Artemisia of Caria for her husband, King Mausolus, and later also the resting place for herself. It was built in the ancient city of Halicarnassus, the best named of all the classical Greek cities if you ask me, which is the present-day city of Bodrum in Turkey. It was finished in 351 BCE, standing approximately 42 metres or 138 feet in height. It was the last of the currently non-extant wonders to be destroyed, as it was demolished in 1494 CE. And now that we've got the dry historical descriptive stuff out of the way, on to the really interesting bits. You know how in the opening sentence I said that King Mausolus was the husband of Queen Artemisia? Well, yeah, he was also her brother. Yes, we have here a case of ancient incest going on. All of a sudden, this great love story of classical antiquity, of a devoted wife constructing a tomb for her and her husband to spend eternity together in, doesn't sound quite so romantic after all. Anyways, Mausolus, when he was alive, was a satrap of the Achaemenid Empire, basically a puppet king taking orders from and paying financial tribute to the Persians. He extended his lands in Anatolia and eventually built his new capital at Halicarnassus, and having reigned for 24 years, he caught a bad case of being dead. And thus it was left to Artemisia to design and pay for the construction of the mausoleum, only for her to copy her husband in the death department a couple of years later. Following which, both of their ash urns were left in the as yet unfinished structure, with the artisans who were working on it deciding to finish the thing, even though they were no longer being paid, because, you know, their boss was very much not alive anymore. And I'm very glad they did, because what a magnificent magnificent building it must have been. In fact, it became so famous that the word mausoleum was coined, which is still very much in use today, which actually makes the mausoleum itself slightly weird because it's the mausoleum of Mausolos, which is a bit tautological, but there we go. And the reason that the building was considered so great that it made the cut for the Seven Wonders list was not because of its size, although it was certainly impressive for its day, but rather because of the artistic style of the place and the incredibly fine craftsmanship involved in its statues and decorations, much of which survive to this day. And I mean, just take a look at this stuff. Look at the incredibly fine detail in these pieces of stone. Think of the epic talent that it must take to carve rocks into such things of fine beauty. I mean, how the hell do you even get muscle, texture and definition into stone, solid rock? I have no idea, but they did, and they constructed wondrous creations with those talents. It must have really blown people away. And so unfortunately we must turn to its ultimate destruction, which was partly natural and partly very much not natural. The not natural part of it being done by the Knights Hospitaller, who were a medieval Catholic military order, not dissimilar to their more famous cousins, the Knights Templar. And just like the Templars, the Knights Hospitaller were involved in various of the Crusades over the course of centuries, and would become fabulously wealthy and powerful in doing so. Anyways, the Knights Hospitaller, having been kicked out of Jerusalem and the county of Tripoli and the Principality of Antioch and finally the city of Acre, found themselves based on the aforementioned island of Rhodes, although long after the Colossus had disappeared from the scene. And from Rhodes, the Knights took various port towns along the Anatolian coast, including the now vastly diminished city of Halicarnassus in 1402. Sometime after this, the mausoleum was damaged by an earthquake, and rather than do the right thing and rebuild it, the Hospitallers just tore it down and used the stones to fortify their castle there, which is Bodrum Castle and stands in the town to this very day. And you can actually still see these obviously out-of-place masonry pieces throughout the defensive works at the castle, and these are remnants of the mausoleum, just thrown up haphazardly among the walling blocks. The Knights also used some of the decorative bas-reliefs from the mausoleum to adorn the interior of the castle, but those were removed in the 19th century and saved, unlike many of the statues from the temple that the Knights destroyed, as they were seen as pagan false god idols and sacrilegious. What an absolute travesty. I mean, nothing compared to the bloody slaughter of innocent people that they had partaken in during the Crusades, but still, come on now. The statue of Zeus at Olympia was a giant seated statue of the king of the ancient gods, Zeus. It was built in roughly 435 BCE and erected in the Temple of Zeus. So you have a statue of Zeus in the Temple of Zeus, which makes sense I guess, but is just a little bit on the nose for my tastes, but whatever. The main body of the piece was a wooden interior with plates of gold and ivory which created the beautiful exterior, which so dazzled the ancient chroniclers that it made the cut for the Seven Wonders list. The construction of it was ordered by the leadership of the Elean people, who were the keepers of the games, literally the organisers of the ancient Olympics. It was 12.5 metres or 41 feet in height according to the ancient sources. However, the exact details of the statue are a little hazy, as the primary descriptions are a little bit contradictory and pictorial evidence only remains on ancient Greek and Roman coins. But what we are pretty sure of is that the Zeus figure held in his open right hand a miniature, or at least miniature compared to the size of him, figure of the Greek goddess of victory, Nike. Also that Zeus wore a crown consisting of a finely sculpted wreath of olive sprays, and the floor of the temple was laid with large, highly polished marble slabs, which created a reflecting pool effect, exaggerating the size and scope of the statue to the human eye. The Roman historian Titus Livius said of the Roman general Lucius Aemilius Paulus, following his visit to the statue in the 2nd century BCE,
He was moved to his soul, as if he had seen the god in person.
So the statue must have been pretty awesome, even if the ancients did very much like to add a poetic flourish to their descriptions of pretty much everything. Anyway, the exact date and manner of its destruction is unknown, with various theories being expounded by the ancient sources. Some suggest it was looted as early as the 2nd century CE, whereas some describe the statue as having been taken to Constantinople, where it was destroyed by a fire in the 5th century CE. However, what does remain is the place where parts of the statue were built. Archaeologists working in the 1950s uncovered the workshops of Phidias, who was the main sculptor and architect of the statue. The archaeologists found tools for working wood, ivory, gold and precious stones, which is pretty cool. I mean, if I had the choice, I'd prefer that the statue had survived rather than the workshop, but you take what you can get, I suppose. We started in Egypt, so we'll end in Egypt. The Lighthouse of Alexandria was, unsurprisingly, a lighthouse built in the city of Alexandria in Egypt, but more precisely it was built on the island of Pharos, which originally sat just off the coast, but was later connected by a man-made land bridge. Its location on the island of Pharos has had a cultural impact far outlasting the structure itself, with the word Pharos being the base from which the words for lighthouse derives in the languages of French, Spanish, Romanian, Catalan, Latin, Portuguese, Italian and Greek. The lighthouse was constructed between 280 and 247 BCE, under the reign of Ptolemy Philadelphus, and although we don't have exact dimensions for the building, it must have been a minimum of 100 metres or 330 feet in height, making it one of the tallest buildings in the world during its time. It was also one of the longest lasting of the Seven Wonders, surviving in some form until 1480 CE. Like I said earlier, when the Egyptians built stuff, they built it tall and they built it to last. Top work, ancient Egyptians. Top work. And in terms of its purpose, the lighthouse was built for the exact same reason that every other lighthouse is built, that being to guide ships to the harbour and to warn ships of impending coastline in the dark. The light from it was created using a furnace at the top of the structure, amplified by a large mirror. The tower itself was described in ancient sources as having been built of large solid limestone blocks. However, modern structural engineering would suggest that such a large building made of that material would likely crumble under its own weight, and archaeological evidence suggests that actually pink granite was most likely used for the main body of the structure, and these facts combined have led some historians to theorise that it was perhaps only the outer casing stones that were limestone, and thus led the ancient sources to think the entire structure was made of that type of rock. And although this building was for a practical purpose, it was not without artistic flourish. Later Arab sources describing the building as having had statues of Triton, who was an ancient Greek god, who was the son of Poseidon and Aphrodite, at each of the four corners of the largest section of the building. The Lighthouse of Alexandria stood for 1800 years, although again that's only partially true. It was damaged several times by earthquakes and had to be partially repaired or rebuilt over the centuries. And finally, in 1303, an earthquake partially destroyed the structure and it ceased to ever operate as a functioning lighthouse again. And then in 1480, the last remnants of the building were torn down, some of the stones being used in the building of the Citadel of Cape Bay, a medieval fortress which still stands on the site to this day. The site is still very much of active archaeological interest, as a huge number of pieces of the old tower and its decorations have been found under the Mediterranean waters, with UNESCO opening up negotiations with the Egyptian government about the possibility of adding it to the World Heritage List of submerged cultural sites. And the lighthouse still holds a very significant local cultural impact, as it features on the flag of the city of Alexandria to this very day. And that's all 7 wonders of the ancient world. But humanity's love of such lists did not stop with the ancients. There have been subsequent wonder lists, including the 7 wonders of the natural world, the 7 wonders of the Middle Ages, and the new 7 wonders of the world. And that last one is particularly notable, as the Great Pyramid at Giza was granted an honorary place on the list of modern wonders as well, showing its true wondrous longevity. But that meant that oddly, the new 7 wonders actually contained 8 buildings, but the more the merrier, I guess. However, that list was somewhat sullied during the popular voting for the 7 available slots on the modern list, by Brazilian companies running a campaign to tip the scales in favour of the Christ the Redeemer statue in Rio de Janeiro, which therefore unsurprisingly won a place on the list, which is all rather ridiculous. It's not even the coolest building in Brazil, for crying out loud. But regardless, all of those subsequent lists were inspired by the original, the one, the only, 7 wonders of the ancient world. I hope you enjoyed this, and thank you for watching all the way to the end. Very much appreciated. And thank you to Steve Shives for doing the voiceovers for this video. His channel is linked below. Go check him out immediately. And the final thank you must go to those ancient chroniclers for telling us all about these amazing buildings. You guys are the real MVP. Now if you like this video, you can like, share and comment, and even subscribe to the channel to get more historical content from me. And if you really liked it, you can chuck your money at me over on Patreon. Links to that and all of my social media are in the description box below. Thank you all for watching, and goodbye for now.